not with the passage of labor market reform legislation in 1965 that we saw the second stream of immigrants come to the United States. There are very high levels of immigration from the mid-70s to 2006, and yet there's a globalization, there's a whole strand of globalization that's really ended. The 1 million that came annually to the United States from 2000 to 2006 fell to 500,000 in 2006, 2007, 0 in 2007, 2008. There's a negative. The United States is now losing migrant population. One might say, well, that's capital market, that's labor market integration, but that's partly because of the barriers that the U.S. has built to the people coming in, and to the costs which have been imposed on existing migrants here. You know, there's a lot of perspectives you can take on this. The first perspective is that cooperation works. Let's just declare victory. If we go back to the very first, just to my very first numbers, I'm not giving you many numbers and graphs in this presentation, but if we go all the way back to the very beginning, and we just looked at this, we can say, hey, the pre-war crisis without the institutions, okay, and without the integration led to this 26% decline in GDP. Since then, the other two crises have been very mild in both the extent of real GDP declines, their duration, the unemployment rate, and in changes in the price level. So that's certainly one thing which could be done is just declare victory in some sense. That's really a first perspective. We could also look at the longest post-war expansion, really one of the longest expansions in world history, 1983 to 2007. There were two very, very, very minor recessions. I guess if you're someone who lost your job, it wasn't all that minor, or had to pay the higher interest rates. But really two very minor recessions over that period, 1983 to 2007. Much of this came about because of the adoption by U.S. monetary authorities and monetary authorities elsewhere of the Taylor rule. Rules kind of won out in the monetary game during this period of the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. In many ways, too, world income distribution has been improving. It's been improving once we account for the increased income of the average person in India and China. That's not my finding. That's Salahi Martin's study in the QJE. If we're looking inside countries and not across countries, of course, income distribution has been getting worse, which again could lead to problems with political stability. There is a second perspective too, that global cooperation is happening in the presence of a malfunctioning large economy. And the malfunctioning large economy really, I think, is the United States. In many ways, the United States works really well. I put malfunction in just to try to catch your attention at this point in the talk. In some ways, cooperation means very little in a crisis. If we establish all these institutions, which do facilitate cooperation, they do facilitate talking, they facilitate exchange of views, they facilitate compromises, they facilitate policy coordination. But the cooperation means little if the crisis originates in a large economy, and the global market and global market integration provides propagation mechanisms for shocks. If we look back at all three of these crises, all three of them originated in the United States. The 29 to 33 crisis came about. I think the major consensus still in the literature is that this came about via Federal Reserve policy failures, via a U.S. money supply decline that was propagated via the gold standard. A gold standard that was not well enforced, a gold standard in which countries had periodically bent the rules. They had started not to follow the classical rules of the gold standard. By the time we get to the 1920s, the gold standard that we have is one where countries regularly break the rules, and everybody else looks the other way because everybody is starting to break the rules. There's a massive failure of U.S. banks over this period. At the very end of the Depression, at the very end of the crash down period, there's a massive failure of U.S. banks. If we look at the 79 to 80 to 82 period, we also see too that the U.S. bank regulatory regime is a disaster at the end of the 79-82 period because of the high inflation that happens during this period. As a result, there's deregulation of U.S. banks. We see U.S. bank failures in the mid-1980s. 2007, 2009, once again, I think Federal Reserve policy failures vis-a-vis U.S. short-term interest rates. The Fed abandons the Taylor rule in the mid-2000s, keeps interest rates too low, doesn't enforce the housing and banking regulations in the U.S. are facilitating speculation in housing. Again, we have U.S. bank failures. There's many other countries in the world that we can look at. Try Canada. Try Canada, where you go to Canada and you find relatively stable banks. You don't find these kind of crises. In fact, there's countries we can point to that really have model banking regulations where you don't see the type of banking instability that we see in the United States and in some other countries. Germany's had problems with its Landesbanks, but on the whole has a relatively stable system. I could certainly point out other countries if we want to talk about that. If we look at 1929 to 1933, I don't want to spend too much time on this in particular, but much of the modern historian looking back at the Great Depression basically sees the real failure not in the initial Fed reaction to the stock market crash of '29. Actually, the stock market had recovered back to its original level by April 1930. It's the 1930 bank failures that then set in motion another crisis in confidence. Okay? The 1930 failures lead to additional policy mistakes at the Fed, but then there's the 1932 and 1933 bank crises, which there's dramatic mismanagement really of the situation in the United States. I want to skip over this slide here. 1980-82. I mean, over this period, we see high inflation in the United States. Part of this is a result of the OPEC oil cartel and its policies. We see attempts to break inflationary expectations with high interest rates and money supply declines. At the same time, there's negative productivity shocks. It's a tremendous shock to the banking system over that period. We see the same thing, really. We see the same thing over the 2007-2009 period. The different banking regimes in the United States. It's useful, I think, and this is really the central point of the talk. I've only got a few slides left here. But if we look at the different banking regimes in the United States, I just want to go back to Eugene White, economic historian at Rutgers, his five different regulatory regimes for the U.S. And I've kind of simplified it to four here. In the post-Civil War regulatory regime, everything was designed to bolster market discipline. There was no deposit insurance. If your bank went under, you lost your deposits. You could file a claim. Usually an examiner would come in and sell the bank's assets, see what was there. You got back only a partial claim to your deposits. There were no bailouts by the government.